There are moments in life when something small interrupts your routine, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to make you pause. Not panic, not rush, just pause. Maybe it's a thought you didn't expect. Maybe it's a feeling that doesn't quite fit your usual rhythm. Or maybe it's that quiet sense that something inside you is shifting, even if nothing outside has changed yet. That's where this begins. Not with urgency, not with pressure, but with awareness. Because sometimes the most important realizations don't arrive with noise. They show up in stillness, waiting for you to notice. And if you've been feeling even slightly different lately, like your reactions are changing, your tolerance is shifting, or your perspective is evolving, then you're not imagining it. You're adjusting. The subtle moment when you start noticing things differently. There's a point in personal growth that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not the beginning, where everything feels exciting and new. And it's not the breakthrough moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It's the middle, that quiet in-between phase where things start to feel off. You notice conversations that used to feel normal now feel draining. You start questioning routines you never used to think about. Even the way you respond to people begins to shift. And at first it's confusing, because nothing big has happened. There's no dramatic event you can point to. But internally, something is reorganizing. This is often where people doubt themselves. They wonder if they're overthinking, if they're becoming distant, if something is wrong. But what's actually happening is much simpler. Your awareness is expanding. And when awareness expands, comfort zones start to feel smaller. When familiar spaces no longer feel the same. One of the clearest signs of internal change is when familiar environments stop feeling familiar. Places you used to enjoy don't hit the same. People you used to connect with feel harder to relate to. Even your own habits begin to feel outdated. This doesn't mean those things are bad. It just means you're no longer the same version of yourself that once aligned with them. Growth isn't always about adding something new. Sometimes it's about outgrowing what once fit. And that process can feel isolating. Because from the outside, everything looks normal. But from the inside, you know something has shifted. You start craving different conversations, different energy, different ways of spending your time. Not because you're trying to be different, but because you already are. The quiet discomfort of outgrowing old patterns. There's a certain discomfort that comes with recognizing your own patterns. Not judging them, not hating them, just seeing them clearly. You start noticing how you react in situations, how you seek validation, how you avoid certain emotions. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's where the tension begins. Because part of you wants to stay the same. It's familiar, it's easy. But another part of you knows that staying the same no longer feels right. This is where real growth happens. Not in perfection, not in sudden transformation, but in awareness. The moment you start observing yourself without immediately reacting, you create space. And in that space, change becomes possible. Why slowing down starts to feel necessary. At some point, you may have noticed that constant movement doesn't feel as satisfying as it used to. Distractions lose their appeal. Noise becomes exhausting. And you start valuing quiet more than stimulation. This isn't laziness. It's recalibration. Your mind is trying to process more deeply. Instead of reacting quickly, you begin reflecting more. Instead of chasing everything, you start choosing more carefully. And while the world often rewards speed, growth often requires slowness. Because when you slow down, you notice things you used to miss. Patterns, triggers, intentions. You begin to see not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And that changes everything. The shift from external validation to internal clarity. There's a moment in personal development where approval starts to matter less. Not because you stop caring about people, but because you start understanding yourself better. You no longer need constant reassurance to feel grounded. You don't rely on others to define your direction. And you stop explaining yourself as much as you used to. This doesn't happen overnight. It builds gradually, through small realizations, through moments where you choose alignment over approval, through times when you stay true to yourself, even if it's uncomfortable. And over time, something changes. You become more stable internally, less reactive, more intentional, more aware. Not perfect, just more aligned. When you realize growth is always visible. One of the biggest misconceptions about growth is that it should be obvious, that there should be clear results, clear milestones, clear proof. But some of the most important changes are invisible. They happen in how you think, how you respond, how you process experiences. No one sees the moment you choose patience instead of reaction. No one notices when you break an old mental habit. But those moments matter because they build a different version of you. Quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. And eventually, those internal changes start reflecting externally. But by then, you're not doing it for validation anymore. The identity shift you can't reverse. At a certain point, growth stops feeling like something you're working on and starts feeling like who you are becoming. You don't force new habits. They feel natural. You don't chase change. You embody it. And this is where things become irreversible. Because once your perspective changes, you can't go back to seeing things the same way. You can't ignore what you now understand. You can't unlearn what you've realized. And while that might sound intense, it's actually freeing. Because you stop pretending. You stop shrinking. You stop trying to fit into versions of yourself that no longer match who you are. If you've been feeling different lately, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way, there's nothing wrong with that. You're not losing yourself. You're refining yourself. And refinement doesn't always feel exciting. Sometimes it feels slow. Sometimes it feels uncertain. Sometimes it feels like you're in between versions of your life. But that in-between space, that's where clarity is built. So instead of rushing past it, pay attention to it. If any part of this connected with you, take a moment to reflect on what's been changing in your own life lately. Not what you think should be happening, but what actually is. That's where your real direction begins, when you start protecting your energy without explaining it. There comes a point where you stop over-explaining your boundaries. Not out of frustration, but out of clarity. You begin to notice how much energy is spent trying to make others understand decisions that already make sense to you. And slowly that need fades. You don't feel the urge to justify why you said no. You don't feel obligated to stay in conversations that drain you. You don't feel guilty for choosing peace over constant availability. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. Because if you've spent a long time being accommodating, being the one who adjusts, being the one who keeps things smooth, this shift can feel unfamiliar. Almost like you're doing something wrong. But you're not. You're recalibrating your relationship with your own time and attention. And that requires a different kind of discipline. Not the discipline of doing more, but the discipline of allowing less. The realization that not everything needs a reaction. One of the most noticeable changes in personal growth is how you respond to situations that once triggered you. Things that used to pull you in emotionally now pass by without the same intensity. Not because you've become indifferent, but because you've become more aware. You start recognizing patterns in people's behavior. You understand when something isn't about you. You see when reacting would only repeat a cycle you've already outgrown. And in that awareness, something powerful happens. You pause. That pause might only last a few seconds. But in those few seconds, you choose differently. Instead of reacting automatically, you respond intentionally. And over time, those small pauses create a completely different experience of life. Less chaos, less unnecessary conflict, more clarity. Why solitude starts feeling more valuable than noise. There's a shift that happens when being alone no longer feels like something to avoid. It starts to feel necessary, not because you're disconnecting from the world, but because you're reconnecting with yourself. You begin to appreciate quiet moments, time without constant input, space where your thoughts can settle without interruption. And in that space, you start hearing things more clearly. Your own ideas, your own preferences, your own direction. Before this, it's easy to absorb everything around you. Other people's opinions, other people's expectations, other people's energy. But solitude creates separation. It allows you to distinguish what's yours from what is. And once you experience that clarity, noise becomes harder to tolerate. Not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer necessary. The subtle confidence that doesn't need to be seen. Confidence at a certain stage stops being something you try to show. It becomes something you quietly carry. You don't need to prove your worth in every conversation. You don't feel the need to win every argument. You don't seek attention just to feel validated. And this kind of confidence is different. It's not loud. It's not performative. It doesn't rely on external feedback. It's built from consistency, from keeping promises to yourself, from learning through experience, from understanding your own patterns and working through them. And because it's internal, it's stable. It doesn't disappear when someone disagrees with you. It doesn't weaken when you're not being noticed. It stays when you stop forcing connections that don't flow naturally. Another shift that often goes unnoticed is how your relationships change. Not dramatically, but subtly. You start paying attention to how interactions feel. Not just what's being said, but how it affects your energy. You notice when conversations feel effortless and when they feel forced. You recognize when you're being understood and when you're constantly having to explain yourself. And over time, you stop forcing it. You stop trying to maintain connections that require you to shrink, adjust, or overextend. Not out of negativity, but out of alignment. Because relationships that truly fit don't require constant negotiation of who you are. They allow you to be without pressure. And once you experience that kind of connection, it becomes difficult to go back. The awareness that growth can feel lonely sometimes. This part isn't talked about enough. Growth can feel isolating, not because you're completely alone, but because fewer people relate to the version of you that's evolving. Your interests change, your priorities shift, your perspective deepens, and suddenly, conversations that once felt engaging feel surface level. It's not that you're better than anyone. It's just that you're in a different phase. And that difference can create distance. This is where many people question themselves. They wonder if they're drifting too far, if they're becoming disconnected, if they should go back to what felt familiar. But growth doesn't always come with immediate belonging. Sometimes it creates space first, and that space is where new alignment eventually forms. Learning to trust your own process without constant validation. There's a stage where you realize that not everyone will understand your path, not because they don't care, but because they're not experiencing what you're experiencing. And that's okay, because growth isn't meant to be fully explained. Some things can only be understood by going through them. This is where trust becomes important. Not trust in outcomes, not trust in guarantees, but trust in your ability to navigate change, to make decisions, to adjust when needed, to learn as you go. You stop looking for constant confirmation, and instead, you start listening more closely to your own reasoning, your own observations, your own sense of direction. And while that can feel uncertain at times, it also builds independence, the shift from wanting immediate results to valuing long-term change. At some point, your focus begins to change. You stop chasing quick outcomes. You stop expecting immediate clarity. And you start valuing depth over speed. You understand that meaningful change takes time, that patterns don't disappear overnight, that real progress is often gradual. And instead of getting frustrated by that, you start working with it. You become more patient with yourself, more consistent in your actions, more focused on the process rather than the result. And that patience creates something powerful: sustainability. Because fast changes can fade, but slow, intentional growth tends to last. If you've been noticing these shifts, even in small ways, it's not random. It's a natural part of evolving, not into something completely different, but into something more aligned with who you actually are. And that alignment doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's subtle, but it's real. Take a moment to think about what has changed for you recently. Not externally, but internally. The way you think, the way you respond, the way you see things. That's where the real movement is happening. And if you're willing to keep paying attention to it, you'll start to understand yourself on a much deeper level.